world always laughs at the rough drafts of the future, Mason Whitlock wheeled his oil-stained, unpolished prototype inside on a squeaking rusted cart, right into a high-tech expo hall dripping with millions of dollars. CEO Charlotte Brofe took one look at him and laughed. "You actually think this scrap heap belongs on the exact same stage as our technology?" Mason just stood there in silence. His young daughter stood close by, ducking her head and clutching a worn-out sketchbook to her chest. Not a single soul in that arrogant room saw what was coming next. That laughed-at engine would spark a $50 million bidding war, leaving wealthy venture capitalists desperately clawing for a piece of the future. You and I know that the most dismissed person in any room usually holds the keys to tomorrow. Stay with me on this journey. Let's wind back the clock. A cold, misty rain fell over the bleak outskirts of Detroit. Too gentle to be a storm, but freezing enough to bite right through your skin. The rain beat against the garage roof, a steady, rhythmic hum that would have put anyone else fast asleep. But true innovators rarely rest. Mason was wide awake. 3 hanging light bulbs cast a warm yellow glow over his workspace. The air was thick with motor oil, fresh metal shavings, and static sparks. That classic scent of an invention being dragged to life. A worn-out workbench lined the wall, buried in old metal files and discarded spark plugs. Right next to them sat a grease-stained notebook packed with complex equations. Written in pencil. True creators expect to fail, and Mason needed to erase his mistakes easily. He was 34, but the deep lines around his tired eyes showed a much harder life. Dressed in a faded blue work shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his battered hands revealed the real story. Heavy calluses coated his palms, with grease ground so deep into his skin no soap could ever wash it out. Yet those hands were steady as a surgeon's while working. He moved silently, carrying the slight slouch of someone who learned that staying unnoticed is the best way to survive. Across the drafty room, bundled up in a coarse blanket on a folding chair, young Hannah Whitlock slept soundly. 7 years old, she had her mother's long eyelashes and her father's habit of retreating when life got heavy. She clutched a cheap composition notebook with a worn, cracked cover. It was her late mother's notebook, packed with thoughts that were half scientific formulas and half intimate letters written to nobody in particular. Hannah carried it everywhere, insisting it made her feel just a little closer to her mother. And of course, Mason never had the heart to tell her to put it down. Just an hour ago, she had looked up and asked a question that was still eating away at him. "If your engine works, will we lose the house?" He could not even promise her they would not. He simply kissed her forehead, adjusted her earplugs, and promised he just needed to run one last test tonight. But what Mason was building was not some magical fluke. Let's look at the facts. It was the result of 6,000 brutal hours of failure across 4 long years. The engine was a masterclass in compact design. It filled the massive, ignored gap between traditional combustion and total electric power, an overlooked middle ground that corporate engineers ignored, as massive market pressures always force everyone toward the extremes. It featured a unique closed-loop thermal recovery system, controlled by a lightning-fast pressure valve, and a custom combustion chamber shape he found only through years of study and brutal, destructive stress tests. He blew up 11 prototypes before succeeding, but that is exactly how real breakthroughs are born. He built this raw experimental engine for basic utility trucks, simple backup generators and tractors, places where power demands violently shifted. You and I know these gritty spaces. They need greasy wrenches, not glossy presentation slides. Like every overlooked visionary, he faced total silence when pitching to 3 massive corporate giants. One ignored him completely. Another sent a lazy automated rejection. The third offered $20,000, trying to steal his patent. A tiny fraction of the years and sweat he invested. He refused, but that very night a crucial breakthrough email arrived. A major investor showcase finally granted him a tiny spot in their exhibition. Just a pity invite hidden in a corner, but elite investors would be there. The very wealthy gatekeepers who could fund his dream or kill it. His little daughter Hannah cheered at the incredible news. Once she slept, he stared at his raw, unpolished prototype. He knew the uphill battle he faced. He knew these high-end events worship shiny corporate slides, flashy PR, and empty marketing talk. A lone mechanic with a hand-welded block and handwritten math would only face quiet mockery. People always mock the packaging. Wealthy executives routinely dismissed his genius without even glancing at the actual data. Turning off the garage lights, he rested his hand on the cold steel, feeling the warmth of a true, working breakthrough that ran exactly as planned. The decision was made. He was going. Come with me inside. The massive investor showcase took over 2 glowing glass penthouse floors in Detroit. Everything was perfectly crafted to keep wealthy investors comfortable. Spotlights gleamed off expensive, useless concept cars resting on pedestals. Giant screens looped through exaggerated performance stats and highly suspect projections. The empty jargon of modern innovation, designed by branding agencies that charge more than a real mechanic makes in a year. Charlotte Bancroft walked the floor with the supreme confidence of an elite dealmaker who owned the room and knew how to extract money. Just 29, she wore a frosty, calculating mask raised to never display any vulnerability. She took over the family automotive empire 3 years ago after her father died, fighting constantly to silence the board of directors and prove her absolute authority. This endless battle hardened her into a sharp, unforgiving force that looked like brilliant leadership or just pure coldness. This high-stakes investor pitch was the absolute turning point of her career. This flashy exhibit anchored a critical funding round that could double their corporate valuation and secure her legacy forever. If their hyped corporate engine worked as promised, billions in new capital would flood in. If it flopped, she would be fighting furious shareholders and lawsuits for 10 years. Lead engineer Connor Blake intercepted her at 7:45. At 42, he carried a loud, unearned arrogance built on 20 years of hijacking credit while carefully dodging every single risk. He smiled, assuring her their star prototype was fully prepared. He claimed it was flawless, but you and I know that was a massive, catastrophic lie. A low-level shop mechanic had actually discovered a major system flaw days earlier. Their shiny corporate models completely failed to predict the soaring thermal numbers. Connor casually ignored the warning sign. He smugly dismissed the data, snapping at Tyler that their current tolerance levels were fine. Meanwhile, Charlotte asked for the list of independent tech inventors. Connor sneered at Mason Whitlock, a working mechanic with a junk prototype, entirely blind to his genius. Charlotte coldly instructed her event planner. Hide those independent nobodies in the back room, far from the main technology showcase. She walked away, believing she had far more important investments to manage. When Mason arrived with young Hannah, he parked near the back service door. A bored security guard merely pointed them toward the dirty freight elevator. 2 staffers stared silently at his rough prototype, their smug faces dripping with quiet contempt for this amateur. Young Hannah stayed close to her father. She observed everything with that quiet, sharp awareness kids pick up in hospitals, instantly reading the elite crowd, figuring out very quickly who was safe and who was dangerous. She could easily sense how these wealthy strangers looked down on them. Mason knelt down next to her before they entered the elevator. He smiled. "We are only here to let the engine run. That is our only goal. We did not come to beg for any favors." She squeezed his hand as they hid in the ignored back room, where Mason began setting up. A few young engineers wandered over, squinting at the unusual recovery loop and compact thermal shape of his invention. One engineer began to speak. Then Connor Blake appeared, glaring at the revolutionary engine with the blind arrogance of a man who sees only trash. He loudly mocked, "Did you build this in a barn?" It was not an honest question, but a cruel public shaming. To him, this historic machine was just junk, and the mechanic was worthless. Mason looked up, calmly met Connor's mocking stare, and quietly went back to checking his wires. He said absolutely nothing, and Connor absolutely hated that heavy silence. Connor snapped that independent outsiders could only test their projects after the main corporate show finished, then stormed off. Mason ignored the blatant insult and simply kept working on his breakthrough. Let us examine the moment that defined the entire morning. It occurred about 40 minutes before the big corporate showcase officially started. Charlotte led a nervous walkthrough for VIPs Samuel Grant and Abigail Monroe. These ruthless investors demanded to see every single inch of the showroom floor. At 58, Samuel Grant had built a massive fortune by ignoring corporate hype and trusting his own eyes. His own father had spent decades working in a gritty machine shop. That gave Grant a rare instinct for spotting real, world-changing innovation underneath a rough exterior. The influential group suddenly stopped right in front of Mason's prototype engine. As Mason adjusted a wire, young Hannah stood nearby, clutching his messy sketchbook. When another wealthy investor asked what the strange device actually did, Mason answered honestly. Light-duty trucks, emergency generators, and heavy industrial gear needing steady power under variable loads. But Connor interrupted before the investor could even reply, adopting a polite but highly dismissive corporate tone. A cheap trick designed to get a quick laugh from the crowd. He joked that anyone with a cheap welder and some scrap metal could call themselves an innovator. A few fools laughed, but you and I know that investors saw real genius. Let's watch this together. Charlotte sensed the crowd's skepticism and struck. She demanded to know if this breakthrough had official lab certification. Mason calmly admitted he had no corporate backing. Official stamps cost far more than his tiny budget allowed. Charlotte smirked. So, you drag a raw prototype to an elite showcase expecting us to blindly trust a mechanic's word? But history shows true visionaries never demand blind faith. Mason wanted no favors. He simply asked to run his motor through a standard load test right in front of the doubters, relying entirely on their very own high-tech measurement systems. Just pure data, not empty promises. Charlotte saw only scrap metal, sloppy hand-done welds, and a rough, visually flawed garage assembly. She judged his worn-out clothes, then completely dismissed him. You really think this garage junk belongs on the same stage as Bancroft Motion's tech? The insult stung, not because she raised her voice, but because these wealthy elites sound so absolutely certain in the way they discard your genius, knowing they have the power to crush your dream. Little Hannah looked down, clutching her worn sketchbook tightly against her chest. Mason gently squeezed her shoulder. Suddenly, the harsh reality of this mockery was clear to everyone. A young girl forced to endure cruel rejection right alongside her father. A reporter pressed record near the exit just as Charlotte finished. This showcase is not a charity for dreams welded entirely from hope. She tried to kill his pitch, completely blind to the revolution right before her. You and I recognized true grit immediately. That is when Hannah whispered fiercely. My dad did not use hope, he built this during sleepless nights. Absolute silence. For the first time, those wealthy investors actually saw the man's dedication. CEO Samuel Grant finally looked closer at Mason's scarred hands and the technology. And at the brave little girl who had just spoken truth to power. Charlotte quickly backpedaled. We might have time later for a quick load test. She marched off. Samuel lingered for a moment, then followed the group. Mason sat down next to his daughter. She softly asked if he was angry. He smiled. No, the world always laughs before it embraces the future. She gave a single serious nod, her signature look of absolute unwavering belief. The dreaded call from the bank arrived at 9:54. A polite voice noted the account was 2 months late, 30 days until foreclosure. Mason whispered his thanks, hung up, and forced to smile before facing her. But Hannah had heard everything anyway. She did not need to ask who called. The truth was obvious. Instead, she opened her late mother's notebook, tracing the familiar, careful handwriting. Never let people who only count cash decide what your genius is worth. Rebecca was a brilliant science teacher who wrote in journals to anchor her mind, the way others pray. She wrote to protect her faith so hardship could never crush it. Losing her shattered him. Mason spent 3 months ignoring his masterpiece entirely. We both know why he returned. His 5-year-old daughter demanded he finish the job. She had caught him staring blankly at the covered machine and simply told him, Mom would be so mad if you gave up now. He smiled at her wisdom and finally uncovered the technology of tomorrow. Breakthroughs always start quietly. Grant returned to the side room alone. He asked how long Mason had been building this experimental engine. 6 years, Mason answered. The last 3 were the best. Samuel then asked for his data. Mason handed him 3 simple pages of handwritten notes. Temperature curves, power levels, fuel use, and a brutally honest log of every single part that failed. 12 valve failures over 5 prototypes, 3 different bearing failures. and a minor explosion that scorched his wall. This data was messy. But it was real. Slick frauds chasing cash only show their wins. This true innovator documented every breakdown and exactly what each disaster taught him. Samuel quietly handed them back. He said he wanted to see the engine run when the time came, then walked away. At 11, the big showcase began. Charlotte gave a flawless pitch. She framed their shiny hybrid drivetrain as the perfect path to full electrification. Completely reliable, she claimed, and ready to scale. The wealthy investors gave her glossy presentation the exact praise it demanded. Connor stood to the side, looking like a man watching his guaranteed victory unfold. But let's look closer. Tyler, their junior engineer, watched the rising thermal readouts. The system temperature was climbing much faster than normal. He glanced at Connor, but Connor just shook his head. As the test pushed into a heavy load, like a truck climbing a steep hill, things shifted. The temperature simply kept rising. The safety controller automatically throttled back the engine power. The main screen flashed a warning in amber. Two powerful investors in the front row spotted that exact screen warning. One asked, "What exactly is that amber indicator?" Charlotte smoothly brushed it off as automatic software keeping things safe. 40 seconds later, a pressure valve popped wide open prematurely. A brief cloud of white steam escaped, small but absolutely undeniable. That puff triggered the exact doubt Charlotte spent 2 years trying to hide. Abigail Monroe spoke up, "If software throttles under normal load, what about fleet reliability?" Connor rushed to spin the story, blaming it on oversensitive safety settings. Tyler just stared down at his shoes. Samuel Grant slowly turned, looking toward that dark hallway where the true future waited. When Samuel demanded to test Mason's engine, Connor immediately started to argue. "It's an uncertified prototype with no backing and no data." Samuel replied, "I didn't ask your opinion on the engineering, I asked to see it run." Charlotte glanced back at her screen, where the warning still glared. She weighed her options and snapped, "Bring it in." Same test parameters, his junk gear and his absolute risk. Out in the hallway, Mason heard his name. He looked at Hannah. She stood up incredibly straight, holding his battered notebook with both hands. He picked up his heavy tool case and walked onto the stage. You can always hear the future coming. His rusty cart rattled across their polished floor. Every executive turned, mocking this raw inventor standing on their $1 million stage. His messy prototype looked ridiculous next to their fake perfection. Connor barked out the rules. They demanded standard load parameters, 0 modifications, and approved software. Mason only asked for 2 things, his mechanical interface and a separate power meter. He slid forward a simple single-page technical spec. Their facility engineer verified the connection was entirely standard. Charlotte watched Mason circle his prototype, finally seeing what the corporate world always misses at first glance. He moved with quiet, precise purpose. The relaxed rhythm of a creator who had run these exact checks 1,000 times. He was not putting on a show, he was simply working. A sinking feeling hit her, that sudden chilling realization that they had completely underestimated him. Just before starting up the engine, Mason quietly said this. His machine was built for harsh, real-world struggles, not a fake corporate presentation. It was built for brutal loads, real work on steep hills, shifting payloads, intense heat, and thick dust. He designed it so regular people could fix it using basic everyday tools. If anyone actually bothered to understand his creation, he was happy to explain every single piece. An impatient investor scoffed, "Just run it," so Mason did exactly that. Its raw roar was far deeper and rougher than their polished corporate engine. A few smug executives exchanged those predictable mocking little smiles. Connor stared with the hungry look of someone waiting to expose an embarrassing failure. But within 10 seconds, the rough noise smoothed into a perfectly steady hum. It was not a shiny toy, but it held the undeniable power of a real breakthrough. Temperature stayed steady. Pressure was completely nominal. Power output perfectly matched the applied load. You and I know what happens next. The heavy load phase, where their pricey corporate engine flashed warnings and failed. The room braced for disaster, but Mason ignored the screens. He simply watched his machine. He just rested 2 fingers against the metal frame, feeling the steady power inside. His hand stayed completely still. Every vibration was exactly what he had designed. The energy output stayed constant, while the temperature flattened out and held. The efficiency metrics on the screen began showing an unbelievable fuel ratio. His fuel consumption was drastically lower than the massive corporate competitors' numbers. Abigail Monroe finally stood up and walked directly over to the screen. She studied the raw data herself, needing no explanation from anyone. Charlotte's defensive guard completely melted. She just stood there with her arms hanging down. An engineer whispered in shock, "The valve reacted way faster than any electronic system." The other replied, "It is mechanical," as if that simple truth explained a miracle. A panicked Connor instantly demanded confirmation from the sensors. "It is the exact same equipment from the Braftoft demonstration." Desperately, he argued that the baseline numbers were skewed by starting conditions. The lead engineer snapped, "The comparison is clean." Connor finally fell silent. Abigail asked if his system could handle a grueling sustained load. Connor protested it was outside the agreed parameters. Abigail ignored him. "Will it run?" Mason simply looked up. "Yes," he replied. "That brutal stress test ran for 16 minutes. Nobody moved." The creator just stood there, answering complex technical questions without any slick presentations. He calmly explained why those incredibly expensive, mainstream hybrid systems always fail under pressure. Standard corporate designs tried to guess load changes using complicated, fragile software. "You and I know how that goes. Perfect in labs, but completely useless when reality hits." They saw useless scrap, but his loop captured lost transition energy. While they scoffed, his basic valve reacted to physical changes instantly. No waiting around for slow sensor data processing like their systems. "You and I know standard system lag destroys efficiency across a full cycle." It caused massive drains, leaving an investor wondering how industry giants missed it. He calmly explained that massive corporate firms are trapped by old supplier contracts and chained to existing factory tooling. They let financial cycles dictate progress instead of pursuing actual innovation. Being completely free from corporate bureaucracy was actually his greatest secret weapon. Hearing his answer, Charlotte recognized the brilliant truth behind his work. That exact rebel mindset had triggered her firm's warning flags earlier today. Connor scoffed, demanding real proof of the engine's long-term durability. The inventor pulled out a bin of labeled failures, showing a shattered valve seat, ruined bearings and cracked combustion liners, with every single failure carefully studied. He looked up. "I do not hide my failures. I keep them to prove why this current engine runs so smoothly." The entire room fell dead silent, but the mood felt completely different. "Let's pause here." The mocking judgment vanished, replaced instantly by sheer awe. Samuel Grant asked how he funded this. His answer? Repairing cars 6 days a week to survive. He even sold his late wife's truck just to build the fourth prototype. He even rejected 2 early buyout offers that would have compromised everything, handing his life's work to corporations who never would respect his futuristic engine. Little Hannah stood nearby, hearing about her mother's truck and staring at her notebook. Charlotte caught the little girl's reaction and refused to look away. Abigail Monroe's patent lawyer, Julian Reeves, immediately asked about the intellectual property. Connor quickly interrupted, claiming that tech shown at Bankfra belonged to their internal review protocols. But Julian fired back that he read the agreement. Those rules only bound tech entered into their specific corporate development program. But Mason registered as an independent builder, falling under totally different rules. This brilliant garage mechanic filed a provisional patent 11 weeks ago. Priority date locked, and the room realized what that meant. They once laughed, expecting a beggar, but this genius held an untouchable protected gold mine. Samuel Grant spoke up. "A factory can be bought, but true visionary genius is not something you can acquire with a check." Abigail Monroe did not hesitate. "I want the first offer. $5 million for industrial rights, while Mason keeps full ownership and the lead technical role." Mason just stood beside his engine. He listened to massive fortunes flying at him, showing zero shock on his face. He just needed a quiet second to realize his revolutionary dream was finally real. Within 90 seconds, a startup consortium pushed the bid to $8 million for urban delivery rights. An energy fund then slammed $18 million down for agricultural and emergency systems. The exact 2 applications our mock creator had suggested first. And here is the incredible climax. Samuel Grant quietly stepped in and bid $25 million. Picture this, not just a cheap buyout, but a massive package to fully fund and protect a revolutionary invention. A real engineering team and a top-tier testing lab, keeping this overlooked founder's original rights and technical authority completely intact. Charlotte finally grasped the scale of Samuel's major offer. If she didn't act, this mocked invention, the greatest technological leap of the decade, would walk out the door with a rival's cash. She marched straight over to the creator. She looked the visionary right in the eye. "I want to discuss a production partnership. Braftoff's massive facilities, testing resources and supply chain, plus global distribution, in exchange for a co-developed product line where your technical genius controls everything." The silent creator just stared at her. He kept completely quiet. Across the room, Samuel Grant spoke up. "Charlotte, are you pitching this because you finally see his genius, or just because you're terrified of losing out?" The question was purely surgical. It demanded absolute truth from a CEO who had just spent the morning pretending this breakthrough technology was nothing but amateur junk. Charlotte glanced back at Samuel, then looked at the brilliant inventor. Finally, her eyes met little Hannah, who was watching quietly by the pillar. Charlotte finally admitted her mistake. "I made a massive error this morning. I dismissed a revolutionary invention because of its rough casing, and I ignored the genius who actually built it. I was wrong. It is the same blind spot my own engineers had 22 months ago when they dismissed true innovation. And worse, I let the arrogant culture that mocks real genius survive inside my own company. I am not saying this just to save my deal. I say it because it is the truth." Then, from the pillar, little Hannah spoke up. "My dad does not need you people to decide his invention is actually valuable. He just needed you to stop laughing at it and treating it like trash." Charlotte stared softly. "You are entirely right," she admitted. "I am sorry." Now the bidding resumed with a completely different energy. The Energy Infrastructure Fund immediately bumped their bid to $30 million. A major logistics brand quickly countered with $35 million for exclusive freight vehicle rights. Meanwhile, Samuel Grant and Abigail Monroe huddled privately, shutting out all the other competing bidders. "You and I know how this goes, when heavyweights unite to build the future instead of fighting." Julian Reeves slid over to the inventor, whispering, "Do not sign a single thing today. Wait until your own legal counsel can review every single term." "I know," the creator replied, leaving Julian staring at him, completely caught off guard. "I have waited 6 years of mockery for this," Mason said. "I won't stop reading fine print now." Samuel and Abigail finally hit their massive magic number, $50 million. $15 million in capital for Whitlock drive systems and $20 million for full certification testing, strict regulatory compliance and pilot production infrastructure. $10 million set aside for critical patent protection and legal defense, ensuring no giant corporate rival could buy up this breakthrough and bury the technology forever. Plus $5 million in a secure trust for little Hannah's future schooling and medical care. The one term absolutely nobody dared negotiate. The creator keeps total technical authority over his entire engine development. You and I know they didn't drop $50 million just for a basic metal box. They paid for 6 grueling years of genius, documented through tireless prototyping, an ironclad intellectual property moat, and 600 hours of flawless operational data. And the real prize? A mocked visionary who just proved to arrogant billionaires that his genius understood the future better than any of them. To the elite gatekeepers who claimed to price the future, that ridiculed design was suddenly worth $50 million. The moment Samuel read that massive offer aloud, the entire room froze. You and I know how silence shifts when massive wealth enters. It forced everyone there to rewrite reality. Even the dismissed inventor receiving it. Mason just stared blankly at that life-changing number. He looked from his humming miracle engine down to his little daughter, Hannah. She wept quietly, clutching her old sketchbook to her chest in pure, overwhelming relief. Stepping off the stage, the brilliant garage inventor knelt before his young daughter. He smiled, saying, "Your mom would want us to read every single page before signing this." Hannah laughed and cried at once, overwhelmed by the sudden crash of grief and pure relief. Slowly, the room finally started breathing. But exposing Connor Blake's arrogant betrayal did not end in some loud, dramatic fight. Julian had already verified the facts, tracing the stolen design through a paper trail on the company servers. The ultimate truth was never in doubt. Connor had first seen a technical summary from Mason sent through his program, and he simply buried it. He labeled it worthless, hiding the breakthrough while the company quietly copied the concept. Let's look closely. He had not legally stolen the engine, but he recognized its brilliance. He decided this backyard inventor was completely beneath his notice. He used corporate power to ensure absolutely nobody else would see this groundbreaking technology. When Mason crashed the presentation, Connor tried silencing him, not because the engine was flawed, but because a working breakthrough threatened the comfortable corporate future he had so carefully built. Charlotte demanded to know why he hid the brilliant submission. Connor arrogantly argued that they received hundreds of amateur pitches every year. He claimed true innovation required corporate credibility and prestigious university degrees. By those narrow standards, a basic mechanics blueprint meant absolutely nothing. That arrogant standard, Charlotte snapped, is exactly what I am changing. Samuel Grant cut in. True innovation does not die from lack of funding. It dies because arrogant gatekeepers refuse to trust hands stained with actual garage grease. Charlotte immediately suspended Connor from all active company projects. She ordered a complete overhaul of their broken, elitist submission system, and promised to build an independent review board for solo garage inventors, featuring a transparent review system that no longer required elite credentials to get a fair hearing. Connor quietly vanished. The fallout over his ruined career would play out behind closed doors, a classic poetic justice that always hits when reality finally shatters a gatekeeper's massive ego. Charlotte walked over to the triumphant father and daughter, kneeling down to look Hannah in the eyes. She said softly, "I made you feel ashamed of your brilliant father today. It was the biggest mistake of my career, and I am deeply sorry." Hannah looked at her father first. Mason nodded gently, and she turned back to Charlotte. "My dad does not need you to think he is rich. He just needed you to respect his invention." Charlotte absorbed the heavy words, then looked at Mason. "I judged your revolutionary technology by its rusty cover. I did the same to you. I did it because dismissing brilliant minds is too easy when you hold the power and nobody stops you. Real visionaries do not look back." Mason replied, "Keep the apology. You cannot replace the moment you stole." Let's face it, he demanded that no visionary would ever have to suffer such arrogant mockery again. Charlotte agreed. Over the next few weeks, Mason obsessively analyzed every single line of the contracts. He reviewed those corporate drafts with the same absolute rigor he used for his engine stress tests. He hired a top-tier patent lawyer and an expert contract attorney. He paid them with Samuel Grant's seed money, which cleared in just 10 days. That upfront cash finally saved him from defaulting on his overdue home mortgage. Slowly, the suffocating money worries that had choked him for 14 painful months began to vanish. Then Charlotte came to his workshop. She left her public relations team behind and drove alone, standing before his rundown door before finally knocking. Mason led her inside. The cluttered workspace had not changed a single bit. There lay the old workbench, the worn notebook, scrap metal, and labeled failed prototype parts. The family photos still sat on the shelf. His calendar still showed all of Hannah's medical checkups, circled in bright red ink. Charlotte walked around slowly, examining the faded labels on those discarded engine components. She stared at his complex handwritten math equations. In that silence, she finally understood. This breakthrough was not some shallow corporate vanity project. It was built out of raw survival and pure love. It was born from the pure grit of an inventor who refused to let arrogant suits dictate his worth. Hannah popped out and asked, "Do you still think my dad's engine is ugly?" Charlotte replied, "I never thought it was ugly. I just did not know how to look at it." Accepting that truth, Hannah walked over and opened her late mother's journal to a back page. It revealed a rough blueprint sketch, an early drawing of the motor with a handwritten note penned right underneath it. "This is going to work. I do not know how yet, but I know this." Charlotte stared at the note, asking who wrote it, and Hannah whispered, "My mom," right before she got sick. Charlotte went silent, seeing that the mother had been completely right. Hannah nodded. "That evening, you and I can picture the two of them talking for hours outside. Charlotte confessed that her own father had started bankrupt-off motion inside. A cramped space no bigger than this garage, with nothing but scrap parts and a dream. He spent 4 years building it before anyone finally believed in his vision. After he died, she felt desperate to prove herself as an unquestioned corporate leader. Completely flawless and cold. Never showing weakness, because her board was full of older men waiting for a young woman to fail. She admitted, "I ended up acting confident instead of actually believing in myself. And soon enough, I could not even tell the difference." Mason did not offer her pity. Instead, he explained that faking mastery versus actually possessing it is like the difference between a toy designed purely to show off and a machine engineered for brutal reality. Both might look flawless under bright boardroom lights, but only one survives the real world. Then came his strict terms. He wanted absolute authority over all engineering decisions. A team pairing raw, grizzled shop mechanics directly alongside elite university scientists. And a fixed portion of profits legally funneled into pediatric lung health programs for kids living near dirty industrial plants. Charlotte accepted. You and I know why. She finally saw the future and signed the contract on the spot. Let's trace where the respect for this mocked invention actually started. It wasn't the sudden apology or the $50 million they offered. It started with a contract that finally took his breakthrough seriously. Whitlock Drive Systems launched, turning the ridiculed mechanic into chief technical officer. The manufacturing giants stepped in, but they played by his strict rules. His high standards ruled before any licensing even started. The moment they signed, he drove to an address kept in his wallet through 9 months of bitter struggle. It was the family who bought his late wife's truck when times were desperate. He knocked, explained his success, and easily bought back the vehicle. He brought it home that night. When little Hannah saw it, she froze in disbelief. Without a word, she laid her mother's design notebook on the passenger seat. "We should keep it here when we go places," she whispered. "We should," he agreed. 8 months later, the facility testing his disruptive technology ran around the clock. No flashy corporate labs here, just a gritty converted industrial warehouse. A massive power grid. And enough room for parallel test rigs and a raw machine shop. Half of his engineering team held advanced academic degrees. The others had decades of hands-on, grease-stained mechanical experience. They shared tables, knowing crucial breakthroughs happen where theory meets the shop floor. Between the scholars doing math and the builders feeling theory hit raw metal. He refused to dump his work clothes. He owned just one suit for boardroom pitches, wearing it awkwardly like a fake costume. Otherwise, he wore his faded garage shirts because building a revolution is still gritty, hands-on work. And he refused to ever forget that. Now stick with me, even the skeptical CEO returned for the test under a redefined role. A partner now, no longer the boss. She arrived early, leaving her spin doctors behind. Facing the workforce, she admitted, "I was completely wrong about this engine at first. And I was totally wrong about the creator. I'm here today to ensure that dismissing genius is the absolute last mistake this company ever makes." Behind the glass, young vocational students watched the once ridiculed engine finally roar to life. He wanted the underestimated to see it. He needed them to see that a self-taught mechanic working with no elite pedigree could, with raw determination and a refusal to believe the corporate elites, build a revolutionary engine that the loudest industry skeptics would eventually beg to buy. Little Hannah stood up front, wearing a badge that read Chief Believer. The team had made that title for her in a sweet ceremony the week before. She was recovering well, and her latest medical checkup brought nothing but relief. They announced the first commercial launch of the engine in just 6 months, providing backup power, powering 6 rural hospitals across 3 states and a massive fleet of delivery trucks. True heavy-duty applications. Meanwhile, the executive who doubted him was forced out. Think about the impact. A new program for independent creators was finally launched. It gave everyday builders a public fair way to submit ideas. In months, 412 underestimated ideas flooded in for review. Let's picture this moment together. The test ended and Mason and Charlotte stepped outside. That sharp golden autumn light shone down, the kind you only see in Michigan. It felt warm and direct, carrying a quiet promise of the massive shift ahead. Charlotte admitted, "I used to think the future had to look polished before anyone would trust it." Mason kept his eyes fixed on the dented truck parked nearby. He looked at the notebook on the passenger seat, then at the massive lab behind them. He said, "Sometimes the future starts in a dark garage if someone keeps the light on." Charlotte paused for a silent second. "I turned off a few of those lights." Mason replied softly, "But you turned some back on." Right then, young Hannah walked out of the laboratory and tightly grabbed his hand. She looked up at Charlotte asking, "Want to hear what it sounds like when it runs?" "You hear it better through the side window." Charlotte gave a warm, genuine smile. She told Hannah she would absolutely love that, and the three headed back inside. Inside, the revolutionary engine hummed, its sound bleeding through the heavy glass in layers. A low, steady rhythm marked the core of the power cycle. A light harmonic shift hummed whenever the power load surged upward. The flawless balance Mason engineered into his recovery system, coming after 4 painful prototype failures. Those early, mocked failures finally taught him exactly what true balance sounded like. It was not loud or flashy, just the quiet sound of a masterpiece running smoothly. Mason stood quietly behind his daughter and Charlotte, watching them through the glass, finally letting out his breath. He remembered those brutal 3 a.m. shifts. The grueling work, angry bank calls, and Hannah asking if they would lose their home. He recalled that painful showcase where the corporate elite laughed, hurting his innocent little girl. He pictured his late wife's notebook and her handwritten message, "This is going to work. I do not know all the reasons why, but I know this." He thought about every arrogant investor who scoffed at his engine and laughed in his face. And how, despite all their ridicule, he chose to keep pushing forward anyway. Not because he had some absolute guarantee that his invention would succeed, but because quitting meant letting smug, short-sighted critics dictate the true value of his life's work. And he knew deep down those experts were dead wrong. The wealthy establishment laughed at his design because it looked like scrap metal. Because he built it in a cramped garage, wore dirty clothes, and lacked a fancy degree. What those wealthy elites failed to see, what they were too blind to test, was its incredible efficiency, and the love that fueled its creation. Years of documented failures, hundreds of cold, sleepless nights. His late wife's unwavering faith preserved in a worn notebook. A little girl who refused to let him quit, and his own refusal to surrender. He would never let their arrogance be the final judge of his creation's worth. You and I know that history's greatest innovations always begin in dark, forgotten rooms. They spark under the worst conditions, built by underdogs the elites dare to call amateurs. They always start as something the self-proclaimed experts openly mock. But when a visionary holds on, refusing to leave that garage, the invention eventually proves its true value to the world. It reveals the world-changing power that was hidden inside all along, just waiting for the doubters to finally open their eyes and see the future. The engine hummed, the data proved him right,